What's the worst accident that happened at your workplace? A man fell 75 feet due to standing on the wrong side of the pipe he was cutting. Have you ever seen those cartoons where they cut the branch while standing on the branch? He was cutting from inside and everyone thinks he just got disoriented. Man crushed in a 40 megaton stamping press. A man had a fatal machinery incident. Take your pick. OSHA needs to set up a permanent office in that workplace. Story 2. The bank where my wife worked was constructing an expansion. During the construction, rigging on a steel beam slipped and the worker was fatally injured by the falling beam. She had explained to customers all day long why the side entrance of the bank was taped off and police cars and other emergency vehicles were present, without actually saying that someone had passed away because, well, they didn't want that being put out there. There was a construction accident. Oh my god, is everyone okay? I don't really have that information. Story 3. Had a cornstarch dust explosion at a previous job, and no, it's not previous because I caused it, lol. A truly stupid guy decided he'd sneak a cigarette break in, basically the worst place he could. He came very close to passing away for his stupidity and could have taken others with him, but thankfully he was the only one seriously injured when the dust went boom. Pretty sure he made himself disabled for life. That night I was pretty far from the boom area doing vacuum decay testing on completed bags of sugar substitute. I was uninjured, but it definitely scared the crap out of me. Story 4. A wheel on the deep fryer collapsed while it was in use, flooded the kitchen with 400-degree Fahrenheit, 200 degrees Celsius hot oil. Thankfully, most people were out of the splash, so the worst that happened was their shoes got ruined. I got a couple of burns on my arms, but that wasn't unusual for me. The manager, though, almost lost a leg. The way it collapsed, it pretty much splashed directly on his leg. Immediate severe degree burns. Happened years ago. He's fine now, but a good chunk of his leg had severe burns. Story 5. I have several jobs. One of them is as a tour guide in a cave. I have a story of my own about how I nearly passed away that I may share if anyone is interested, but this story is not my own. One of our biggest rules is to always do head counts and safety stops, especially on the walk out, because people tend to linger and fall behind. It's dangerous to leave people behind, but also someone could have a medical emergency and no one may notice if you don't stop and check. 2 years ago, that happened. A tour guide wasn't tending to their group on the walk back and it didn't make stops to gather people and make sure everyone was okay. It's a moderately easy trail, but someone had a medical emergency and her family didn't notice. She had a heart attack, fell, and was left behind. It's something we stress so much because it is a real issue. Always tend to your guests. Story 6. Nothing tragic, mostly funny. Not at my actual workplace, but I traveled around the big 3 automaker plants in Southeast Michigan as a consultant for one of their divisions. This dude was driving an electric lift truck and for some reason there was an issue. This gets the bright idea of pulling the cable that connects the battery to the truck. Instantly loses the ability to stop or steer and is too dumb to press the e-brake. Goes right through a wall into a bathroom, taking out all the plumbing and flooding half the building. Story 7. This happened January, -30 outside. I install insulation in newly built homes. Understand the doors, windows are not installed yet. Working with one other guy who is my quote-unquote trainer. Insulation requires bats of insulation, vapor barrier to vapor the insulation, and caulking. My buddy took the role of vapor barrier and I turned around to walk away and I just heard a boom, bang. I came back around and was like, dude, what did you do? This kid was laying on his back, showing a red liquid and had a hard time speaking. And what happened was he cut a piece of vapor barrier and mixed with the snow on the floor, he stepped on the barrier and slipped. And here I am calling 911 because it's a brand new home, the ambulance couldn't find the street. Also because it was so cold, nobody was working the whole street, different contractors, so it's just me and him. And there's a big window right next to him and it is freezing. So I gave him my jacket and he told me walking around him really hurt his back by movement, so I took the extra insulation and covered him up to keep him warm. An ambulance found the place, but holy crap, it was nice knowing he wasn't the only one working that day. Story 8. Someone didn't follow lockout, tagout protocol. Guy grabbed a wire and was electrocuted so badly it shot him out of his boots. He was gone pretty much instantly. Another time, this guy walked right off the edge and fell. Dude had been doing this kind of work for 15 years. Just got way too comfortable being up in the air that high and wasn't paying attention to where he was walking. I traveled for work so these events didn't happen at the same place. Story 9. I work at a well-known, accredited zoo, which I will not name for obvious reasons. Chimpanzee escapes. 2 or 3, nothing terrible happened but could have ended very, very badly. Several kangaroos were spooked and jumped over through a fence. All but one had to be put down immediately. Cassowary escape. Again, not a terrible ending, but big, scary, aggressive bird on the loose? No thank you. Maintenance explosion causing vision loss. Story 10. I work in an office, so I mostly see minor incidents as a first aider. Some of the more memorable ones. A particularly memorable case was a clothing-related mishap with a zipper. We trimmed the fabric and used tools to release it, then sent him to the emergency department. An older lady was hit by a car exiting the work car park. Although it was low speed, she sustained serious injuries. During a fire drill, someone tripped while carrying a metal-cased first aid kit down the stairs. The case fell and severely injured another evacuee's arm. Our fake emergency quickly became a serious real one. Now, I didn't witness this, but a colleague had a serious cardiac event on a football oval during an intra-company rugby match and unfortunately passed away on scene. During a first aid refresher course, I heard vivid stories from parks and environment workers about severe industrial accidents, people falling into vats of acid, being crushed, or falling into deep holes. The most intense story involved the safety protocol at a large industrial facility for extreme incidents, where an injury is deemed not compatible with life. In such cases, no resuscitation effort would be made. Story 11. A guy in a suit wearing a hard hat was screaming at someone on the phone while standing directly beneath a piece of equipment hoisted by a crane. Several people told him to move only to be yelled at and threatened with job loss. The rigging snapped and the equipment fell on him. I saw the whole thing. It was a terrible accident. I wish I felt bad for him, but the guy was obviously a rich piece of crap. His passing probably made a lot of lives easier. Story 12. Not nearly as bad as many of the others here, but I saw a coworker get his glove caught in a sheet metal roller. It's a machine that you feed sheet metal into and it rolls it into a cylinder. There is a big sign above it that says, "No gloves," but he used gloves anyway. His fingers and hand got pulled into the steel roller before someone else slapped the emergency stop. They had to disassemble the machine to get his hand out, and they immediately provided first aid to control the serious injury. He was then rushed off to the hospital where he had his hand surgically amputated following machinery injury. Story 13. I worked at an after-school care place. We had 2 gyms, and in between them was a lobby-type space that also led off into classrooms. On the outside of one of the classrooms, they had glass windows but had giant metal beams running across the windows. I always assumed to stop blunt force from breaking the window. Anyway, one of our biggest rules was you do not run through the space between the gyms. For various reasons, the floor was a different texture and would sometimes be slippery, and kids were getting called home and were leaving through that area. This one day, this kid we will call Kevin decided to, run through. Kevin and another friend were apparently chasing each other, so Kevin took off through the lobby and almost ran into a smaller kid. To try and avoid the other kid, Kevin veered to the left but lost his footing and went face first into one of those metal beams. It injured his gums. There was a lot of red liquid, but thankfully no teeth missing. His mom actually had just shown up, so we got her to the back, and the first thing she said to him was, "This is why they tell you not to run." I believe he got a couple of stitches, but was back to the program the following week. Another time, a kid accidentally stepped behind another student who was about to swing a baseball bat. The girl was struck and appeared dazed, so I supported her and kept her still while we waited for the paramedics to arrive. Oh, I just remembered, another kid was visiting his friend in my classroom and they were talking and the kid was walking backwards. He wasn't paying attention and tripped over a book bag and broke his arm. I too had to keep his arm stable while he faded in and out of consciousness while waiting for the paramedics. Story 14. A coworker broke his back in a fall at a medium-sized hardware and lumberyard store in the late 1970s. They had a highly sketchy process to get water heaters out of storage. No safety gear was provided. An employee would ride the forklift forks with no pallet or railings up about 15-20 feet, walk over and off his ceiling, wrestle the desired water heater onto the forks, and then ride it down while holding onto the water heater and balancing it on the forks. Well, the guy in the water heater fell. The store manager who knew about this process told us it was the coworker's fault for not being careful and that he should have declined if he was not comfortable with the task. I'm surprised they didn't deduct the cost of the water heater from his pay. I quit soon after and don't know if OSHA ever found out. Story 15. I worked in a bar. After I'd been there about a month or two, one weekend it was packed. Some guy was seriously injured right at the bar. The dude was annoying, whistling really loudly, and was, from what I heard, the annoying and obnoxious type. Someone just walked up behind him with a glass and injured him. Nobody saw what happened until the guy was standing there with both hands on his throat with red liquid visible through his hands and a mortified face. One of my friends working security ran over to him, and after the victim removed his hands, the security worker used the victim to push through the crowd to get him out of there ASAP. He survived, and the guy who did it was never caught as far as I know. I heard it was most likely some gang stuff later. Story 16. I worked at Staples. Every 2 weeks, we'd get a paper delivery. I'm talking about dozens of cases, each filled with 10 reams of paper. And for whatever reason, it always came on just one pallet. So that pallet was goddamn heavy, easily over 1,000 pounds. It took a bare minimum of 2 people to push it across the store. One day, a guy I knew and my ops manager were moving it from the truck, him pushing the jack, my manager pulling. I was there just bullcrapping with them. The guy pushing the jack must have not been paying attention because he pulled the release lever while his foot was under the pallet. Heavy as it was, the pallet didn't drop. It crashed to the concrete floor. It caught half of this guy's foot, resulting in a serious injury with a significant amount of red liquid visible on the floor. The most surprising part was that he didn't lose the whole foot, just a couple of toes from what I heard. I'm not sure. We didn't see him again after that, and honestly, I can't blame him. Story 17. I used to be a stagehand for one of the largest production companies in the US, and we were tearing apart a build. They had lowered one of the big trusses filled with equipment so we could strip it down. A little old lady asked me to help her, and without hesitating, I ducked under the suspended truss to get to her side, stood up to help her, and watched as a good 4-foot-long, couple hundred-pound chain slams down into the ground right where I had been standing. If it didn't end me, it would have crippled me for life. Story 18. I was a grocery store warehouse worker in high school. One night I was operating the forklift and accidentally hit one of the overhead water mains for the first suppression system. I was reversing so I didn't see it, just got hit with a blast of ice-cold water and didn't know where it was coming from until I turned around and realized I messed up. It flooded the warehouse and started flooding into the store. Due to the drop in water pressure, the fire alarm went off and the store was evacuated. The fire department showed up and had to shut the water main off to stop the leak. I was incredibly embarrassed and thought I was fired for sure. I went home to change into dry clothes, and when I got back to work, the general manager was there assessing the situation. I apologized and he just said, "It's okay, crap happens." I worked there for another 2 years until I graduated and moved on to better things. Story 19. Not at my workplace exactly, but with one of our residents while they were AWOL in the community. I worked in a group home for youth 12 to 18 with a history of mental illness and substance misuse. A female youth fell asleep under a truck while intoxicated. The owner started it up in the morning, hopped in and started his commute, and ran this poor girl's head over. She passed away instantly. A lot of us were pretty messed up after that. Group homes get a bad rap, and for good reasons in some cases, but damn, did I care for the kids I got to know and to care for. She was a good kid, but pretty involved in the substance scene, and a long history with mental health for such a young gal. Story 20. Working for a specialized trucking company, a fellow driver lost control, fully loaded, going down a winding mountain road. The truck tipped over, slid across 2 lanes of oncoming traffic, and landed in a field. The truck and trailer were absolutely demolished, the cab was flattened, and the driver crawled out the back window without a scratch. $400,000 unit wasn't even recognizable. Guy was fired when insurance pulled the ECM out of the rig and found he was going over 100 kilometers an hour around a 50-kilometer-an-hour corner and didn't even touch the brakes. Alright, sounds like me playing American Truck Simulator. Story 21. I worked in reprographics and we used to use these big Kodak machines. They were like a regular copier but on enhancers. Just Google it. Anywho, we ran the copy room for the office of PGE. The copier was behind a counter and you were supposed to come up to the counter, leave your order, and then come back to pick it up. We had these on 2 different floors. I was working the late shift and you rotate every half hour between the 2. A dude comes in, sees I'm not there, and since he's a smart corporate dude, surely he can do my job. These things were belt-fed machines, and if the paper jammed in the copy tray, it would reverse the belt and attempt to feed it back in. Well, this guy leans over the feed tray, and his tie gets caught in the U-belt. The machine starts pulling him forward, and because it automatically tries to clear jams by reversing, it keeps tugging him back and forth. I have no idea how many times it happened, but if he came in right after I left, it could have been going on for a while. When I got back, he was completely dazed with his tie jammed in the rollers and the stop button just out of reach. I jumped over the counter, hit stop, and freed him. He looked exhausted and pretty roughed up, but thankfully he was okay. Dude looked like he went 20 rounds with Tyson, so maybe not the worst, but definitely the funniest. Was he okay? I didn't care, screw that guy. I also saw the same machine injured a lawyer's wrist because she thought she was quick enough to snatch her copies out of a moving pneumatic tray. She wasn't, and despite all her schooling, she still couldn't do my job. I also saw a dude injured 2 fingers using a cutting machine that he deliberately disabled the safety features so he could cut faster. Good times. Story 22. More gross negligence from multiple aspects, but I used to work as a community carer, going to people's houses and providing care for them so they didn't have to go to a care home. One of my colleagues was only 16, 17 years old, a relatively thin and short girl who had only recently passed the terrible, unpaid 1 week long training course, which mostly consisted of copying legal stuff from a textbook to a worksheet and then signing it so the company was less liable for your screw-ups. She was given a very short 15-minute call to go alone that she'd never been to before. The carer she'd shadowed, who was then the on-call for that morning, just told her to make him breakfast and get his meds sorted. So she went to the house, let herself in, and introduced herself. Checked what was in the kitchen for breakfast, made him buttered crumpets as that's what they had in the kitchen, and then left him with the crumpets to go back into the kitchen to check the care book on what his meds for that morning were. After a couple of minutes, she checks back in with the meds and he's choking. He's picked up an entire crumpet and tried to swallow it without chewing. She panics, takes time to instruct him to stand so she can do the Heimlich maneuver. She's too small to properly get her arms around him and fails. He's still conscious but loses his footing and is now on the floor still choking. Panicking further, she makes a call, but not to the emergency services, but to the on-call carer, who is also on shift and does not answer. She tries back thumps to no success. The individual keeps choking while she makes more desperate attempts to call the on-call carer. After a few calls she gets through, the on-call carer instructs her to call the emergency services and press the fall alarm pendant for first responders and cuts her own call short to rush over in her car. Unfortunately, it's too late for the service user. He asphyxiates to his demise and the on-call carer, first responders, and ambulance crew arrive to find the service user passed away and the teenage carer crying. No one had warned the carer of the service user's compulsion to eat without chewing, and specific instructions to cut up food or blend food were only at the back of the care book, in a section that would have taken longer than 15 minutes to read. And she had only been given 15 minutes to arrive, introduce herself, get breakfast and meds, note in the book, wash up, and leave. Our employer, being one of the biggest care providers in the UK, called every carer it employed thousands of staff in for emergency quote-unquote training, signing more waivers, to make sure they would not be legally liable for future screw-ups of the same magnitude. Story 23. In my country, construction site workers are often considered as alcoholics, and surprisingly, that's often true. When I was younger, I worked as a helper on a construction site. Here are some accidents. One dude fell from scaffolding and, being intoxicated as heck and around 10 meters above the ground, he managed to fall on some elements of the scaffolding on his way down, which probably saved him. His jaw, right hand, and thigh bone were broken. A dude was about to fall off a roof. Somehow, he shoved his hand between two wooden elements on the roof, damaging the skin on his palm, and was dangling for 15 minutes before someone helped him. Another guy was doing some work inside an apartment, and while cutting something with a grinder, he injured his arm. It wasn't severe, but there was some red liquid. Of course, he was intoxicated, so he didn't mind the mess. But when the apartment owner returned and saw everything covered in red liquid, she fainted, and then they had to call an ambulance. Come to think of it, it's weird I haven't seen anyone pass away. And if you're enjoying the videos so far, somehow, don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 24. During a patient's bath, a staff member accidentally loosened the device that helps him breathe. When the patient coughed, it became dislodged. Instead of immediately calling for help, she mistakenly discarded it and continued the bath before notifying a nurse. The patient was briefly without proper airflow until an emergency replacement was inserted. The next day, it was swapped out for the correct size and the patient stabilized. No one reported this, I was not present for this, and I'm so freaking fed up. The woman who caused this issue has a long list of freaking crap up without thinking. So I reported her to APS, and I'm gonna keep reporting her until she's fired. Until then, I've asked to be put on every single shift she's on so I can follow her around and make sure she doesn't screw more crap up. She also gets paid more than me. Story 25. Not in my workplace, but happened to an old coworker of mine. I worked with a man that was a reformed member of a hate group. He was raised in a hate-filled environment and got educated enough to leave and make something of himself. After dedicating himself to the company we worked at together, marrying a beautiful wife and raising 2 beautiful kids, he left for a better job in a steel mill. He became a role model for people around him and a pillar in the community. After 3 years at his new job, a crane failed and a several-ton roll of steel pinned him against a machine. Luckily, loosely used, a coworker was close and gave him a cell phone to call his wife and kids as EMS were on the way. The scenario was like a movie where he was only alive because he was pinned. There was nothing anyone could do to save him. So he got to say his goodbyes to his loved ones and passed away on the shop floor. I think about him a lot. Story 26. I'm sure there are stories that I haven't heard yet, but the worst one I've seen personally is someone I worked with was retrieving some boxes of merchandise off of some graded flooring. His glasses slipped off his face and he stepped towards the grating to reach his glasses and accidentally stepped in a gap between two separate sheets of grating. There were some decently thick wires sticking out from the sides of it, and it scratched this guy's leg from the ankle to the thigh, and then injured directly into the thigh a good inch or two. The grating was bolted down to the mod we were on, and he had to sit there with his leg injured until the safety team assessed the situation, and then until they called maintenance to unbolt the grating. He was out for several months, and every department had to go overboard talking about how safety is the #1 thing we should focus on doing anything in that building. But the guy ended up being okay after all was said and done. I'm surprised he didn't get fired for stepping on the grating. Stepping on the grating is and had been constantly brought up as a big no-no, and we were not to do it. Story 27. We used to have break rooms with no windows and lockable doors at the place I work. One day, a mother was in the break room using her pump. I suppose it was most comfortable for her to pump. Little did she realize that she'd left the door unlocked. An unsuspecting guy wanders into the room while this lady is pumping, realizes after he closed the door behind him, and panics. Amidst the chaos of trying to hurriedly get out of the room, the guy trips, ends up losing his clothes, and falls straight into the woman. They were still intertwined on the ground and trying to separate by the time someone heard them and checked in. We no longer have access to those break rooms since the accident. A real tragedy. Story 28. This is something my dad told me. My dad is a plumber and was going door to door in an apartment building to fix the heating elements. I don't know if they're actually called that, but the things that usually sit under windows and warm up a house, with one of his colleagues. He then knocked on one of the doors and they got no answer, so they knocked again, but still no answer. They had gotten keys to the houses so they could just pop in, do their work, and leave if no one's home. So my dad used the keys he had and yelled out, "We're plumbers, just here to do a routine job," in case the person living there was sleeping or something. So they fixed the elements in the living room and then were going into the bathroom and see if there was an element in there as well. There, on the floor, was a woman. My dad's colleague immediately told my dad they gotta leave and call the cops, but my dad said we might as well fix the element in there, she won't mind. But his colleague was stubborn and eventually convinced my dad to leave. Weird, I know. So the cops arrive and interview my dad and his colleague, and then the mother of the woman arrives and starts blaming my dad for her passing and saying things like, "She's medicated and why didn't you do anything?" Anyway, a few days later, my dad finds out what happened to her. She was probably in the living room and had mixed alcohol and her meds and started to get dizzy. She moved to the bathroom and collapsed, but as she collapsed, she hit her head. Story 29. Disclaimer, I don't work there, but was told this story during a tour of the factory, so I also don't know if it's the worst thing to happen there. Anyway, I was on a tour of a concrete factory a few years ago and was shown the machinery for making long-span concrete slabs. To increase their load capacity, they tension steel wires with multiple tons of force and then pour concrete on top of the wires. Being a curious fella, I asked if one of the wires had ever snapped while under tension, and that indeed happened before. And he said they were lucky it didn't fly sideways because that would essentially have turned it into Agent Whiskey from Kingsman 2's whip, slicing everything it touches in half. Instead, it shot straight backwards, hit a guy, and pinned him to the concrete wall behind him, but despite that, the dude was fine. Story 30. Many moons ago, I was driving a 7.5-ton truck to Leeds heading up the M1. I jumped in the middle lane to overtake a Class 1 vehicle, just got past the Class 1, and a minibus shoots past me at ludicrous speeds. The next moment, they hit the central reservation and the minibus flipped. I swerved to avoid the minibus and ended up on the embankment. Thankfully, the lorry I'd overtaken saw what happened and performed an emergency stop. The driver and myself jumped out to assist. I'm a first aider, and it turned out so was he. I came to a lady very seriously injured. The other driver checks her over and asks me to stay with her, not to allow her to move and to keep her talking. And while I'm sitting there with her, I can see him going from person to person. At this point, I'm solely focused on the lady who keeps asking me where her husband is. I ask her to describe him. He is apparently wearing a Simpsons t-shirt, so I start looking to see if I can spot him. It's at this point I really take in the carnage around me. Until then, I was operating on pure adrenaline and autopilot. Then I spot the t-shirt and I start looking around, and the other driver is literally sitting on the floor crying, holding a freaking child. I lost it. I vaguely recall the emergency services turning up seemingly instantly. This lovely WPC took me to my wagon and just sat with me and the other driver as we both cried. All the survivors had life-changing injuries, including the lady who I sat with, who is paralyzed for life. 3 passed away, including the child. The other driver and I became friends until his passing a few years ago. I took 6 months off and never returned to driving professionally, and neither did he. By the time I got home, at least 10 hours had passed. The company sent a spare driver down to get me in the truck. It wasn't until I got home that I even realized I was covered in red liquid and I cried all over again. 25 years on, I still have the occasional nightmare of that event. I honestly wish nobody has to see that, ever. Story 31. I was running a machine that rolled out color bond roofing sheets, and he decided to walk into the machine while it was still running. When I saw him walk into the machine, I thought he passed away. I ran to the control panel to hit the emergency stop button, but somehow he managed to lift the sheet, but he was being crushed. Luckily, I was close to the emergency stop button, so he was pinned down by the sheet. He should have been terminated. I don't know to this day how he managed to survive. His wife came out the next day and thanked me for saving his life. If I had been further away, he would have not made it. I think he thought that he was gone. I laid awake in bed that night, going over it in my head. I got that adrenaline hit that you get when you're about to experience trauma. And he downplayed it like he wasn't in any trouble, but he was in complete denial. Story 32. I worked at an automotive steel plant that made parts for cars that are notorious for not using their turn signals. They had these giant steel coils that weighed about 6 tons each. To lift them, they would use special straps with a nylon jacket. 2 weeks prior to the incident, I had filed a safety report regarding a particular set of straps. They were completely compromised. They ignored the report, citing, "It's just a jacket," when in reality, they were being cheap. It wasn't just the jacket. Poor guy who didn't know any better was using them to lift up a coil. The workplace got sued so hard, I quit about 2 to 3 weeks after. Story 33. I worked in oil and gas and demolition for a while. I've seen a few minor things, but other accidents have happened that I wasn't a witness to. Now, most yards I worked at had at least one dude with a missing finger from slinging pipe and tubular goods. One story is of a banksman helping a lorry driver to close his extendable trailer. The banksman was underneath holding the pin out so the driver could reverse the cab and close the trailer. The guy pops his head up at the last minute and the trailer just closed right on his head. Like I said, I never saw this happen, but the stain was there for quite a while. Another banksman was slinging up an anchor chain from a low loader. The crane's jib wasn't long enough to raise all the chain off the bed. Instead of lowering it and reattaching somewhere, they just slew the jib to try and slide the chain off. As the chain hit the ground, the crane went up on an outrigger and it crumpled. The whole chain came down on this one dude. Story 34. Around 2017-2018, I was working in a very small care home as a housekeeper/laundry attendant. I was improperly trained and taught nothing about emergencies, just things I was told I shouldn't do. As a housekeeper, we are taught not to touch the residents unless they ask for your help and depending on what it is. Situation examples: good, they need you to grab an item for them. Bad, they need help with the bathroom. If it's anything like the bad, you are to get a qualified staff member for them. One day I was changing some beds when I heard this echoing thud down the hallway. I poked my head out the door and saw a male resident hobbling towards me in a panic. He said the lady next to his room is fallen and can't get up. I ran to her to see if she was conscious, and she was, albeit quite upset, and there was red liquid on her face. She couldn't move and I wasn't allowed to touch her. So I started shouting for help. The nurse's desk was further up the wall but close enough to shout, but no one came. I told the older gentleman to stay where he was, told her not to move, and ran up the hall to the desk. No one was there. I ran to the other hall and no one was there either. I ran to the break room. No one. Where was everyone? I was shouting the whole time, trying to find someone. Eventually, I panicked so badly, I ran to the kitchen and told the cook what was happening and that I couldn't find any of the qualified staff. She immediately kicked into action, told me to go back to her and she'd get people. I don't know where they were, but the cook had found them after I was with the woman for about 2 minutes and finally she got help. 911 was called and she was taken to the hospital. She was okay, she broke her nose and her eyes were blackened like a raccoon. But my God, it was so stressful. Why weren't there any staff members around where they should have been? Why hadn't anyone told me about them not being there? It was such a horrific place to work. It sent me to the psych ward. And I can imagine people would think this is an awful place for residents there too, but I can assure you that was just a horrible incident, but so rarely do those types of situations happen. The people there just go when it's their time. They had all the care they could get there. Story 35. My first day of work during training, I introduced myself to a second employee trainee who was a middle-aged woman. After some small talk, she asked about my family and I responded politely. I then asked about her family and her face grew grim. She responded, "They're all gone, all of them." I quickly changed the subject. My second day of work, I walked into the break and food room at 8 a.m. to find a woman on all fours with her and the room covered with little white flakes everywhere. Frazzled, she immediately got up, turned around and said, "Sorry, my egg exploded after I pulled it out of the microwave." There were thousands of pieces all over her face, the floor and the cabinets, specifically her eyebrows, so many. So far, I've been at this company 1 month. Story 36. My dad is a bus driver. One of his mates went into the back of a lorry. Luckily, he swerved to the right and got a few cuts despite being pinned, wrecking the bus though. On the first day back from the time off he was given, someone walked out in front of his bus trying to end it all. The person survived, but if he hadn't been carrying a note, the driver would have been done for by careless driving if the person would have passed away. The irony being that the driver was on the same route. Another thing that happened is that one of the drivers deliberately ended someone whilst on shift. The driver was being threatened on multiple occasions, and he snapped, warned the guy that he was going to run him over if he didn't move, then he did. The dashcam footage shows a guy hanging onto the wipers before getting pulled under the bus. The worst part is the driver continued his shift and went back to the depot. Said to the mechanic not to look under the bus, got found guilty and served 9 years for it. The police wanted to scrap the bus, but the company told them to do one, hosed it down, and put it back on duty. The other drivers call the bus Christine now. Story 37. Former urgent care medical assistant, work-related injuries I saw come in. Guy came in with his hand wrapped, super talkative. We unwrapped his hand, he turned white and said, "I didn't realize it was that bad." Passes out. For some reason, he reached into the space between the bars of an industrial fan. Guy comes in, says he cut his foot, he can't walk, he collapses every time he tries to step. He worked in some kind of food factory and that day they just happened to sharpen their knives. He dropped his knife, it bounced and hit his foot. He goes to step to grab the next piece of food he needs to cut. He falls, he's sitting in the waiting room, red liquid pooling around him. I come out to assess and yell at the front office girls because they see the red liquid and don't think to call us. Turned out when his knife hit his foot, it actually hit his Achilles tendon. Guy worked for a company that delivered big and heavy objects to people's homes. He was delivering a huge safe. As he was lowering the safe to ground level from the truck, it slipped off the truck, landing on his steel-toe boots. They didn't do much. After x-rays, shockingly, no broken bones. He apparently recovered well. Story 38. It's a toss-up for me as both resulted in lost digits. When I was a fresh-faced 20-something, I worked at a lumber mill working on bundles of molding. I was at the end, counting them into groups of 20, tying both ends, and tossing it onto a cart for the primers to come get them. They tell you not to wear gloves while operating the saw. Well, a guy a station or two before me didn't want slivers as he was ripping boards, until his glove got caught on the blade and yanked his hand through it. The second, I was in the Army. Having already served active, I re-enlisted with the California Army National Guard as a logistics and supply guy. We got deployed to Kuwait and we have these massive trucks called HETs, Heavy Equipment Transports. The trucks have these long and heavy-duty trailers designed to haul Abrams tanks. The trailer was a neat bit of tech. Each wheel could be isolated and lifted in the event of damage, and it had a control box on the side to lift them and the gooseneck to connect it to the trailer. Of course, all of our equipment is made by the lowest bidder, and there are plenty of issues, one being the gear for the gooseneck. I don't know the technical term for the type of gear, but it's a shaft that bends at an elbow that often gets stuck facing the wrong way, not allowing it to drop. The only way to fix that is to manually shove it back the right way. A lot of people would grab the edge of the trailer and kick it into place because, well, meathead. One guy did it and had his other foot in a bad spot. The sand shifted, and when it came down, his foot was under the leg of the trailer, pinning him there. He started screaming, and his guys ran over, calling for an FLA, field line ambulance. They used their helmets to dig his foot out and got him on a truck into the med center before it even arrived. He eventually needed surgery. When he returned from the hospital, he showed us the x-rays. The fracture pattern spread through his foot in a way that almost looked like lightning branching out in every direction. I get called overly cautious for sticking to safety guidelines. I don't know, I think I'm the right amount of cautious. Story 39. Worked for an outdoor equipment hire company that would set up campsites for schools and such. We were only a small team of 5 guys and we would travel in 2 vans. One day, the van I was in arrived first and we started work, expecting the other van to show up shortly. After a few hours though, still nothing. Eventually we learned that the other van had been forced to swerve to avoid another vehicle that had suddenly pulled out of an almost completely hidden entrance in a hedge along a country road. The van plowed straight into a telephone pole. Both guys are fine except for whiplash, but ironically the guy on the passenger side only survived because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He was able to quickly jump across to the driver's side because he saw the pole was about to crush the passenger side. If he'd been wearing a seatbelt, he wouldn't have been able to dodge in time. Story 40. My ex-workplace, there was this woman in her 40s, an alcoholic, a very petite woman. Anyway, she ended up having a seizure in the kitchen of the restaurant. She was hitting her face against the floor. I put my hands underneath her head so that she was hitting her forehead against my hands instead of her whole face on the floor. It lasted for maybe 2 minutes. It felt both longer and quicker than that though. She stopped seizing and was trying to wipe up her mess. We stopped her, of course, saying we'd get it, and we sat her down and I got her a glass of water and we waited for the ambulance. She couldn't afford it though, so she refused to go. She was mostly back to normal mentally at that point. as she'd been in a daze for a bit after the seizure stopped. Her husband came and picked her up. She had a few more seizures at home and got on meds and was doing better last I'd seen of her, but the alcohol will inevitably end her eventually. She already had cirrhosis of the liver, I believe, or damn near close. Nice lady. Hope she's doing okay now. Story 41. I worked for a tire company and was delivering customers' winter tires from storage to a Porsche dealership. I was standing in the truck watching a bunch of employees try to push a parked Porsche out of some snow. One guy tried to push the rim of the front tire. I guess he put his fingers on the inside of the rim. Everyone pushed and the car rolled. He screamed as his fingers got caught between the rim and the brake caliper. They rolled it back and got his hand free. They basically just encased his hand in snow to try to numb it, while another guy was trying to keep his attention and talk to him. Afterwards, I spoke to another mechanic and he told me the sad part was that it was the guy's last shift before a vacation to Jamaica to patch things up with his wife who wanted to divorce him. And if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.